Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Alright, Reddit, I'm at last prepared to tell you about what transpired in Asheville, Kentucky in the middle of the 1980s. When I was 12 years old in 1982, I lived in this quiet coal mining town with my mother, Beverly, and stepfather, Thomas, where nothing ever happened. Mom operated the local post office, which made her the unofficial center of town gossip, while Thomas worked the night shift at Blackwood Mine and arrived home every morning covered in coal dust. I used to spend hours reading comic books and seeing neighbors tending to their gardens on the wraparound porch of our house, which was located on Maple Street, third from the corner. With about 800 residents, Asheville was the type of place where everyone went to the same church, shopped at the same supermarket, and could tell which families were struggling financially simply by looking at who purchased generic cereal. The pace of life was slow. Furthermore, I genuinely believed that I would pass away from boredom before I ever reached high school. On a Tuesday morning in March, everything changed when Mrs. Halfman from the neighborhood rushed into the post office and waved a white package like if it was a blaze. Before school, I was there to assist Mom in sorting the mail, and I recall how Mrs. Halfman's cheeks turned red from running, and her normally flawless hair appeared wild. The letter was criticized on her voice trembling with anger. She wanted to know who had access to the mail. Her name was written in neat block letters on the envelope. There was a single sheet of paper with what appeared to be information regarding her husband's gambling debts, but no return address. Debts that were purportedly cleaned up years ago. The fact that the letter included precise sums, dates, and even the name of the Louisville bookmaker only made matters worse. Mrs. Halfman insisted that just 3 people were aware of such specifics: her spouse, herself, and the bookmaker. The issue was that the bookmaker had relocated to Florida, and her husband had been deceased for 2 years. Despite Mom's attempts to soothe her, Mrs. Halfman persisted in saying that they were all being watched. Someone with information they shouldn't have. 3 additional families received similar letters within a week. The Hendersons received one that included the amounts and dates of how their teenage son, Carl, had been pilfering from the church collection plate for months. A letter was sent to the Johnsons describing Mrs. Johnson's recent specifics about a particular birthmark on the man's shoulder that only someone who has seen him nude would be aware of, as well as an affair with the married pharmacist to Towns. Away, however, the letter that was delivered to the Presleys was the one that truly rocked our neighborhood. The material in their package described how Mr. Presley had been using funds from the emergency fund of the volunteer fire department to cover his daughter's medical expenses. The letter detailed exactly how he had been transferring funds, contained fake signatures, and included photographs of bank documents. The depth of detail frightened everyone. These weren't mere gossip or rumors. These factors necessitated a deep understanding of people's personal life, financial documents, as well as interpersonal connections. The village quickly began to fall apart. After decades of friendship, people started to distrust one another. The church was accused by Mrs. Henderson, since she had access to the collection records. She was the secretary responsible for composing the letters. Because they believed the pharmacist's wife had learned of the affair and was out for vengeance, the Johnsons placed the blame on her. The most frightening aspect, though, was how precise each and every detail was. Carl Henderson lost it when confronted and admitted to robbing the church. Mrs. Johnson vowed she had never disclosed the birthmark to anybody, but she did not deny the affair. In the end, Mr. Presley acknowledged the misappropriation, but claimed that even the bank auditors had missed his traces since he had done such a good job of hiding them. The letters revealed more than simply secrets. They were bringing to light things that many believed had been hidden for ages. Before going to bed, Thomas began arriving home from work early and inspecting all of our windows and doors. At the post office, Mom stopped chatting with people because she was worried that whatever she said may somehow wind up in one of those white envelopes. The letters continued to arrive. They were always delivered to mailboxes at night and on various days of the week, despite the fact that half the community saw who delivered them, alternating in the role of watchman. For 3 nights in a row, old Mr. Bailey sat in a chair by his front window and remained awake. However, he himself never saw the enigmatic letter writer. Every envelope had the same name and in the same meticulous block letters, using a regular blue ballpoint pen, and it was made of plain white paper without a watermark. In rural Kentucky in 1982, Ed McQuaid, the police chief, gathered a number of the letters for examination. Advanced forensic testing was not available to us. He was only able to verify that the handwriting seemed to be purposefully concealed, most likely by the writer using their non-dominant hand to evade identification. Even more disturbing was the fact that the letters appeared to be directed at certain individuals for particular purposes. They weren't chosen at random. All of them were respected or trusted members of the community, those whose secrets, if revealed, would do the most harm. By summer, the matter had progressed beyond mere rumors and embarrassment. The Riverside family was given a letter explaining that their grandfather, who was said to be dead, had actually left them 30 years prior after embezzling their neighbor's life wealth. The letter contained pictures of the grandpa working at a hardware store and his current home in Oregon, where he was allegedly residing under a false identity. Mrs. Yates, the neighbor, was confronted by the family. She started crying and she said that she had never disclosed the theft to anyone because she was too embarrassed to acknowledge that she had given someone access to her late husband's insurance money. The family's bond was ruined by the disclosure, which also caused division in the neighborhood. The letter that made all the difference then arrived. An envelope was delivered to the Nelsons, including proof that their daughter Chloe, 15, had been covertly seeing a married man in his 30s from the neighboring county. Motel receipts, pictures of them together, and thorough accounts of their meetings were all included in the letter. It was the type of knowledge that only someone who had been monitoring them, following them, and recording everything they did could provide. I had never seen Mr. Nelson get so furious in my life. He was a quiet mechanic at the neighborhood garage, but after reading that letter, he changed completely. He took his shotgun from the firearm cabinet and drove directly to the man's home, demanding that justice be done for what he believed to be his daughter's mistreatment, before the neighbors were able to take the gun away from him. Mr. Nelson shot the man in the leg to terminate the altercation. Though it could have been much worse, the episode signaled the beginning of the letter's transformation from a source of humiliation to one that was actually hazardous. Mr. Nelson was taken into custody. The wounded man was taken to the hospital, and Chloe tried to harm herself that same evening because she was so disturbed by the violence and exposure. I will always remember the ambulance sirens blaring through our peaceful neighborhood at 2 a.m. We all knew what had happened, and they were audible to everyone in town. The messages had finally drawn blood, and the enigmatic author had achieved total chaos, exactly what they appeared to desire. The consequences were disastrous. Mr. Nelson was accused with assault with a dangerous weapon and attempted murder. While Chloe recovered from her suicide attempt, she was placed with family in a different state. Their 3 children had to deal with stares and gossip everywhere they went after the injured man's wife filed for divorce. The worst thing, though, was that the letters continued. If anything, their frequency and ferocity increased. The relatives of those who had been attempting to solve the riddle became the target of the subsequent wave. A letter was delivered to Police Chief McQuaid, describing how he had been accepting money from nearby companies to ignore infractions of the health code. Copies of checks, pictures of him taking envelopes, and statements from business owners who acknowledged they had been paying him 4 years were all included in the letter. Upon the arrival of the state police to conduct an investigation, they discovered evidence concealed in a fictitious bottom drawer of his desk, precisely as the letter had indicated. McQuaid was taken into custody inside hours, depriving our community of efficient law enforcement at a critical time. When families began exchanging letters about one another's efforts to unravel the mystery, the paranoia reached a breaking point. The Whitman family received a letter informing them that Mr. Torres, their neighbor, had been surreptitiously monitoring their phone. Discussions with tools he had purchased from a spy catalog. A letter revealed to Mr. Torres that the Whitmans had been searching through his trash each night for hints as to who might be penning the letters. The mystery writer seemed to be able to see and hear everything, and they knew just how to turn the whole neighborhood upside down, opposing itself. People changed their hairstyles, stopped conversing with their neighbors, and started sleeping with weapons by their sides. Within a week, the neighborhood hardware store ran out of motion sensors, deadbolts, and security cameras. Nevertheless, despite people's best efforts, the letters continued to end up in mailboxes. It seems as though the author foresaw every security precaution and made adjustments accordingly. Many families attempted to watch their mailboxes by sleeping in shifts, but when they woke up, they discovered that letters had been delivered in the brief time they were asleep. By the end of 1984, almost half of the townspeople had left. Many families had departed, forcing the local school to merge many classes. The remaining inhabitants lived under continual fear and mistrust, and businesses closed because there were no more customers. And the letters had changed. Instead than merely disclosing long-kept secrets, they started forecasting future behavior. A letter alerting the Grimm family to the fact that their son would be caught stealing from the grocery shop on a particular day and time was sent to them. When that date finally came, their son was found shoplifting, just as the letter had said. The Coopers were informed one Sunday afternoon their adolescent daughter would be discovered consuming alcohol behind the church. At the exact moment specified in the letter, she was apprehended. It seemed as though the author was somehow planning events and coercing people into carrying out the prophecies, rather than merely witnessing the town's secrets. The mental strain was intolerable. People began to wonder if they were in charge of their decisions, or if someone who appeared to be aware of every thought and action they made was controlling them. In March 1987, precisely 5 years after the initial letter, the abrupt end occurred. By that time, I was 15, and my family was one of the few that had remained in Asheville. Mom had taken over as temporary postmaster after her predecessor left town, and Thomas had been promoted to mine superintendent. The previous month, we had received a letter of our own, explaining how Thomas had been fabricating safety reports at the mine in order to reach production targets. Naturally, the letter was true, and Thomas had told his mother and the mine owners everything. Desperate to maintain his employment and provide for our family, he had been taking shortcuts that might have resulted in fatalities. My parents' confidence was shattered by the confession, and it never fully recovered. But something changed on that last morning. Mom discovered an envelope addressed to the entire town. She was going through the mail. There was only one sheet of paper, with a single line on it. The truth has been told. I finished my task here. That was it. Just that little farewell note, with no explanation or signature. The letters ceased entirely after that day. No more secrets, no more forecasts, no more disclosures. The town was irrevocably altered when the enigmatic writer disappeared as abruptly as they had appeared. While some families made an effort to mend their connections, the harm was too great. Others just sought to move on after acknowledging that their secrets were now known to the public. The Nelsons were among the few who never fully recovered from the trauma. I've pondered over the years whether the letter writer was a resident of our community, observing our day-to-day activities and making notes. Or perhaps it was an outsider with contacts in the neighborhood, a previous inhabitant who had maintained relationships with the appropriate individuals. In actuality, we never discovered the person responsible. The letters ceased, the mayhem finally subsided, and things gradually became more normal. Asheville, however, was never the same. The populace never bounced back, the majority of the businesses never returned, and community trust was irreversibly damaged. I seldom ever return after moving away for college in 1990. However, I can still see the consequences of those 5 years when I do. People still appear cautious around one another and are unwilling to divulge personal information, continuing to dreadfully and hopefully check their mailboxes. I lived in Brookhaven, Nebraska, a sleepy, slow-moving town in the late 1990s where everyone seemed to know each other. I took care of my Uncle Frank, who had been residing with me. Following hip surgery, most mornings, while working part-time at a tiny neighborhood hardware store, he was in his 70s, sharp, unyielding, and adamant that he didn't require assistance. However, I believe he secretly enjoyed the companionship. Our errands were mostly routine. Weekly trips to the grocery store, the post office, and Whitlow's pharmacy to get his blood pressure medication and vitamins. That location had existed for ages. People had the same level of faith in it as in their own churches. Not many people were surprised by the first death. Mrs. One Morning, Zellen Wade, a quiet widow who led the community center's knitting club, was discovered in a recliner by her son. No struggle, no signs of distress, just gone. People thought it was a heart attack. She lived alone, was elderly, and had some health problems. However, a few days later, Mr. Grant Holloway, who had just spent the weekend with his grandchildren, was also discovered dead in his bed in a nearly identical manner. No discomfort, no alert. People began to mutter at that point. In the same week, the healthy elderly simply passed away in their sleep. It was uncomfortable. At first, Uncle Frank saw that his vitamins tasted strange. It's just incorrect, not quite rotten or bitter. He joked about it, said it reminded him of the stuff he used to clean his fishing gear with. I brushed it off at first, figuring it was just a new brand or a faulty batch, until I observed a little burn-like mark on the inside of one of his pill bottles, precisely where the cap twisted on. It appeared like a melted bubble, like the plastic had reacted to something. I considered about discarding the bottle, but something in my gut prompted me to keep it. Frank started feeling nauseated in the mornings after taking them, and by the 4th day, he was pale and feeble. We discontinued the medicines immediately, thinking maybe he'd acquired a sensitivity. We didn't understand we were going dangerously near to something considerably bigger than a faulty batch. I took the bottle back to Whitlow's and wanted to talk with someone about it. The guy at the counter, Jeremy, barely looked at it, just remarked sometimes the heat sealers malfunction. Nothing to worry about, but he wouldn't let me retain the bottle. Claimed to require it for inventory. I asked if there had been any other complaints and pushed a little. He stopped. Not visibly, but I noticed the flicker. That brief moment when a person's mind races to think of the safest falsehood. I checked with a few neighbors that evening. As it happens, Ellen and Mr. Whitlow's filled the medications for a haul away. The white pill bottle with the yellow tag and the same vitamin brand. I had the icy, unsettling feeling that we had been only inches away from something that nobody was prepared to publicly discuss. I found additional patterns the deeper I dug, formed. According to Ellen's son, she recently raised her vitamin intake after receiving advice from a pharmacy employee. According to Mr. Holloway's daughter, he had changed brands twice previously at the suggestion of a Whitlow's employee. That summer, the pharmacy began carrying a line of high-end senior vitality supplements, which they had all been purchasing. I swear, I wasn't initially attempting to play detective. However, it seemed that no one else would pose these queries. Not the local newspaper, not the coroner. Everyone simply nodded, as if this was all a coincidence or a case of poor luck. However, people weren't randomly dying as they slept. Not here, not in this manner. After we stopped taking the medication, Uncle Frank began to improve, regaining his color. He resumed his jokes and demanded that a portion of the grass be mowed, despite the fact that he continued to limp. Just in case, I kept the original pill bottle in a zip bag hidden beneath the sink. A local reporter called Dana Bricks visited the store a few weeks later. She was investigating reports of an increase in deaths among the elderly. She started sniffing around after I described what I'd discovered, even though I didn't tell her everything. It didn't take long until she connected even more dots. Turns out there had been 6 similar deaths since spring, all quiet, all elders, all from different sections of town, but bound together by one thing. Whitlow's drugstore. Things quickly got out of hand. After Dana published the piece, initially dismissed as tabloid fare, one of the families later insisted on an independent toxicology report. They discovered something terrible, traces of a compound similar to cyanide, but label altered and in such low doses that it would have gone undetected in standard tests. Micro-poisoning of those vitamins was being done by someone. It was subtle enough to mimic natural causes, but strong enough to kill an old heart. When the police became involved, the town's trust quickly began to erode. Whitlow's closed its doors the same day the story broke. The shock came when they arrested Mr. Carlton, the pharmacist. I'd known him since I was a kid. He was the kind of man who remembered birthdays, handed out free lollipops to kids, and sponsored local baseball teams. Everyone admired him. He was drowning in debt, gambling, poor investments, and rumors of a second family in another state, despite his white coat and friendly smiles. Those senior citizens' insurance policies, he'd quietly convinced several of them to sign over power of attorney, or had access through family members who trusted him with their elderly parents' meds. It wasn't just sick, it was surgical, chilly, planned. Uncle Frank was one of the lucky ones. I still think on how close he got to being on that list. The investigators requested us for the remaining tablets, and when they tested them, the same substance was detected. Frank had inadvertently been consuming little doses of poison for about 2 weeks. The doctor said if we hadn't stopped when we did, his heart might not have handled it. That knowing tormented me for months. I replayed those mornings over and over. He claimed to feel strange or too exhausted to move. I dismissed it because of his age. Turns out it was something far darker slithering beneath the surface of our peaceful routines. The trial was a circus. Carlton first entered a not guilty plea, but the evidence was overwhelming. Documents revealed falsified batch numbers, altered inventory reports, and even a private notepad with dosages linked to 2 certain client names. The picture showed pages lined up like a checklist with the names of actual neighbors, acquaintances, and family. That's something I doubt I'll ever forget. It went beyond simple treachery. It was a form of wickedness I didn't believe someone could commit. Not in this location. Not by someone we literally trusted with our life. Whitlow's never reopened after that. After years of being boarded up, the building was eventually converted into a pet grooming facility. However, nobody discusses how things used to be. The town's residents become more reserved and silent. It altered the way we perceived one another. In the end, Frank moved out west to live with my cousin, stated that he wanted to be nearer to his grandchildren, but I knew that part of that was simply to get away from everything that had transpired. I can't hold him responsible. I feel like I'm staring at a stage where a horrible event once occurred every time I walk by the corner where the pharmacy used to be. Beneath a screen of friendship, How someone like Carlton could accomplish what he did and still be smiling is still beyond me. That's what sometimes keeps me awake. The ease with which he coexisted with us while harboring that secret, not the poison or even the deaths. He greeted us each day, shook our hands, offered counsel, and then returned to the small room behind the counter to plot another murder. Evil doesn't always seem as you might expect. It occasionally asks how your weekend was while sporting a white coat on a soggy Thursday night in late September 2006. The entire ordeal began. I'm Jason, and I was 28 years old at the time. I lived in Oxford, Mississippi, in a peaceful area called Magnolia Heights. About 3 years prior, my wife, Angela, and I had purchased our first home there. It was a simple two-story colonial, with a large oak tree in the front yard and a wraparound porch that gave us the impression that we had finally grown up. I was overseeing building projects for a nearby business. The town library was where Angela worked. Additionally, we were the type of couple who genuinely delighted in entertaining our neighbors with barbecues and mowing the yard on the weekends. In the best sense of the word, life was predictable. From the elderly Mr. Vincent, who collected vintage cars, to the young family next door who had twin toddlers who were always running out of their yard. We knew everyone on our street. We didn't even consider crime. Hell, Angela would go into the grocery store with her handbag on the passenger seat, and she would leave my truck unlocked half the time. When I got home from work that evening at around 7:00 p.m., everything changed. I knew something wasn't right as soon as I turned into our street. 3 houses down, Mrs. Patterson was standing in her driveway, drenched from the rain, making crazy gestures at a policeman who was taking notes. I could see boxes and tools strewn around the concrete floor as if someone had racked the place, and her garage door was ajar. The image felt unreal because of the creepy strobe effect created by the red and blue lights of the police car bouncing off the wet sidewalk. Mrs. Patterson saw me pulling into my driveway and hurried over, her eyes wide with terror and her grey hair glued to her skull, when someone broke into my garage in broad daylight. They took my husband's toolbox, the leaf blower, and even the Christmas decorations from the rear corner. "Thank God you're here, Jason," she cried, holding my elbow with both hands. This was a woman who typically complained about dandelions in her lawn, not someone who had been violated in her own home. And I had never heard the desperation in her voice before. The officer, a young man who seemed to prefer to be somewhere else, completed his report and informed Mrs. Patterson the Hendersons had their shed cleaned out. The Garcus lost their lawn, and he would file it with the others. That's when I found out that this was the 7th break-in on our street in the last 2 weeks. The cops said they had no leads, no witnesses, and frankly limited resources to investigate what seemed like random property crimes, and that someone had even broken into the Miller's house while they were at church on Sunday, taking electronics and jewelry. After he left, Mrs. Patterson and I stood there in the drizzle, both of us realizing our little bubble of safety had been completely destroyed. I tried to reassure her, but to be honest, I was getting a little uncomfortable myself. When I entered, Angela was already preparing dinner, humming along to the music, and she continued to talk about how violated she felt, and how she would never sleep well again, or that someone had been in her space touching her belongings. The following morning, I discovered a handwritten note in my mailbox that would alter everything. It was from someone named Captain Mitchell Browsard, a recently hired employee, but when I told her about the break-ins, I saw her face change from carefree to genuinely worried in about 2 seconds. A tall, silver-haired man with a commanding presence that made you automatically respect him. The retired sheriff had moved to our neighborhood about 6 months prior, and I had seen him around. The note, written in neat, precise handwriting, explained that he had been keeping an eye on the situation with the recent break-ins and wanted to set up. Of the way he wrote it made it sound official and urgent, as if we were dealing with something far more serious than some opportunistic thieves. He was inviting everyone on our street to a meeting at his house that Saturday night to discuss security measures and coordinate a response to what he called this escalating criminal activity. His tone gave me the impression that someone with actual experience was finally handling the situation. Angela, who had been jittery ever since I told her about the break-ins, double-checked the locks and asked me to walk her to her car when she left for work, read the note over my shoulder and said we should leave right away. We thought that having a retired police officer lead our neighborhood's response was just what we needed. And on Saturday night, almost every home on our street was represented at Captain Browsard's meeting. His home was spotless, with every book on the shelf in its proper place, and the man was thorough. I'll give him that. He had prepared a small presentation with charts showing the locations and times of each break-in, set up folding chairs in his living room, laid out coffee and store-bought cookies, and even prepared a small presentation. He stood at the front of folks. What we're dealing with here isn't random, he began, pointing to his hand-drawn map of our area, as he walked into the room wearing a clean button-down shirt and spoke with the authority that came with decades of law enforcement experience. These crimes show a pattern. Someone who is familiar with our patterns, who has been observing us, and who knows when homes are unoccupied. The way he stated, observing us, chilled the room. Mrs. Patterson gave a forceful nod, and I noticed that other neighbors were looking at each other with concern. In his thorough and genuinely impressive plan, Captain Browsard explained that although the police were overworked and understaffed, we could take proactive measures to protect ourselves and one another. He recommended that we set up a phone tree for instant communication, set up regular patrol schedules where volunteers would walk the neighborhood at various times, and above all share our daily routines with one another so that we would be aware of each other's movements. The retired captain offered to organize everything, stating that his experience made him the obvious choice to lead our efforts. He even suggested that we all invest in better locks and security systems, and that we should consider when someone should be home versus when their house would be empty. The more we know about each other's movements, the better we can spot suspicious activity, he explained, and he handed out sheets for us to write down our work schedules, our usual grocery shopping times, our regular church times, and any upcoming vacations or trips. It all made perfect sense, and by the end of the meeting, everyone had signed up to participate. Angela squeezed my hand. Captain Browsard had given us hope that we might regain control of our area, and I slept soundly that night for the first time since the break-in began, she said, as we made our way home, feeling that we were finally taking tangible steps to defend ourselves. Captain Browsard was extremely organized, creating laminated cards with everyone's contact information, establishing specific patrol routes, and even setting up a communication system using walkie-talkies he somehow acquired. The program was launched the following week, and at first it appeared to be operating flawlessly. He would email the group every morning with updates regarding weather conditions and any suspicious activity reported overnight that could impact our patrols, as well as notifications of impending schedule modifications. The man was a well-organized machine who was aware of Mrs. Patterson's doctor's appointments, the late shifts of the carcass, and when the crazy parties that the break-ins completely stopped after we started the program. For 3 weeks, our neighborhood was quieter and safer than it had been in months. Vincent would be out of town visiting his daughter. He kept detailed logs of everything, which he said was crucial for identifying patterns and potential security gaps. Angela was sleeping better. I had stopped obsessively checking the locks. People were actually thanking Captain Browsard in the grocery store, and there was talk of expanding the program to include the streets next to ours. To be honest, we all felt like we had found the answer to our problem. However, strange things began to happen that didn't quite make sense. One night, at around 9 p.m., I was on patrol when I noticed that Captain Browsard's house was completely dark, which was strange because he had stated in his email that morning that he would be working on watch schedules at home. His car was in the driveway, but all of the windows were dark, and there was no glow from a computer or television screen. I assumed he had gone to bed early, but something kept reminding me. He sent his regular update email the following morning, saying he had spent the night before going over patrol logs and working on security upgrades. Later that week, when I mentioned in passing that I had noticed his house was dark during was such a small thing, but it stuck with me because Captain Browsard was usually so exact about everything and his explanations seemed almost rehearsed. Then Angela said she'd seen him at the grocery store on a day when he'd been on patrol, and he had this weird expression on his face for a brief moment before laughing it off and saying he'd probably been in his basement office with the blinds closed. The first real red flag appeared about a month into the program, when he specifically informed the group that he would be out of town visiting his sister, and when she waved at him from across the parking lot, he appeared to quickly get in his car and drive away without acknowledging her, which was completely out of character for someone who usually went out of his way to chat with neighbors. When I saw Captain Browsard, dressed in all black and carrying what appeared to be a small duffel bag, he was strolling down our neighborhood with purpose, not doing a casual patrol, and I was arriving home late from a job site, perhaps at 10:30 p.m. I watched him from my truck for a few minutes trying to figure out what he was doing, but he vanished between two houses, and I lost sight of him. He was leaving his house toward the end of our street where the newer families lived, and the strange thing was that he wasn't supposed to be on duty that night according to our patrol schedule, and he'd never mentioned doing additional solo patrols. I brought it up during our weekly meeting, asking if we should better coordinate late night patrols, but he quickly dismissed it, saying he'd just been unable to sleep and decided to do a quick walk around the block. It was odd that his usual email update the following morning contained no mention of any late night patrol activity, as he documented everything down to the smallest detail. A couple of other neighbors exchanged glances, and I could tell I wasn't the only one who thought his explanation sounded off, but his tone was defensive in a way I had never heard before, and he immediately shifted the topic to talking about installing new security lights. Then the break-in resumed, but this time it was different, more focused, and more professional. During their daughter's wedding, which Captain Browsard was undoubtedly aware of, because Mrs. Henderson had brought it up at our most recent meeting and asked if someone could watch over their home. The Hendersons were attacked. The robbers knew exactly where to look for valuables, avoiding obvious targets like the television, and taking jewelry from a secret drawer in the bedroom and money from a coffee can in the kitchen pantry. No evidence of forced entry was discovered by the police, indicating that the perpetrator either had a key or was competent enough to pick locks without leaving evidence. The timing was also ideal, as the thieves struck during the precise window when the Hendersons were assured to be absent, seemingly with the help of the comprehensive schedule data Captain Browsard had been gathering from all of us. He expressed his outrage and concern about the worsening situation during the emergency neighborhood meeting he called following the Henderson break-in. I closely observed his face. He was saying all the right things, but there was something performative about his anger, as if he were acting out his feelings rather than truly feeling violated on behalf of our neighbors. The way he kept pushing for more detailed schedule information from everyone, claiming we needed to be even more thorough about tracking our movements, started to feel less like security and more like surveillance. The truth came crashing down. On a cold February morning, when I was running late for work and forgot my lunch on the kitchen counter, I made it about halfway to the job site when I realized and was forced to turn around. My heart began to race as I parked a few houses down and watched Captain Browsard's car parked in the Vincentis' driveway. I was certain that they were supposed to be in Atlanta visiting their son, because he had made specific mention of it during our most recent phone tree check-in. Captain Browsard carrying a small bag and behaving as though he belonged in his car, was strolling casually from the backyard toward my truck when he noticed it. He waved cheerfully and came up to my window with that same assured smile he always had when we met. "Just doing a security check," he said. The way he kept looking back at their house and the anxious energy emanating from him suggested a different picture. "Check on the Vincenti place," he began, but his explanation was forced and empty, making sure everything looked secure while they were out of town. Nodded and grinned, but as soon as he drove off, I sent a cell phone call to the police, and during the traffic stop, the responding officer discovered that Captain Browsard's car contained obvious evidence of break-in tools, as well as items that had been reported stolen from several neighborhood break-ins over the previous few months. The entire sick plan fell apart in a matter of hours. Taking advantage of our trust and the comprehensive information we had willingly provided him about our schedules and security weaknesses, Captain Browsard had been using our neighborhood watch as the ideal cover for his crimes. He had meticulously examined our routines with the accuracy of a professional investigator, then used his experience as a law enforcement officer to carry out break-ins that left little trace. He'd been the fox guarding the hen house, and we'd given him everything. He needed to rob us blind, and the most frightening thing was how methodical he'd been. The police discovered a detailed notebook in his house that included maps of every house on our street, lists of our work schedules, vacation plans, and even notes about where people kept spare keys or which windows might be easier to access. Before he was able to organize the watch group, the early break-ins were merely reconnaissance missions to establish a pattern of crime that would justify his neighborhood security efforts. He could strike with surgical precision, knowing exactly when homes would be empty and what was worth stealing, once he had our full trust and detailed information about our lives. Although he was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison, the sense of violation went far beyond the stolen items. He confessed to planning 8 separate break-ins over a 4-month period, using our own fear and desire for safety as the ideal cover for his operation. The neighborhood watch was immediately disbanded. Mercer, Oklahoma in 1995 was the kind of place where people still measured time by harvest seasons and church bells. I was 24 years old that summer, just out of college with a teaching degree, and had just moved back home to help my aging parents run our small hardware store on Main Street. He had weaponized our sense of community and made our desire to protect one another into the very thing that made us vulnerable. My dad often said that Mercer was God's country, unaffected by the craziness of major cities, and I believed him. On a good day, the town had around 800 residents, the kind of place where everyone waved to one another and left their doors unlocked. We had pure air, honest jobs, and the purest well water anyone could desire, pumped directly from the aquifer that ran beneath our red dirt roads, crystal clear and ice cold. We never once questioned what we were drinking, but on a sweltering Wednesday morning in July, the first indication that something was seriously amiss appeared. Inside the store, Mrs. Abernathy from the farmhouse 3 miles away staggered through our front door, her face as pale as milk, her colorful floral dress, which was always vibrant, smeared with what looked like vomit, and she was clutching her stomach with both arms, clearly in distress. "Harold is in the hospital." She managed to gasp between dry heaves, and when she tried to speak, her voice was hardly audible above a whisper. The baby, too. Mrs. Abernathy was tough as nails, and I'd seen the way she said it, with such unadulterated fear in her eyes, constrict my chest. She used to manage livestock and repair fence posts during thunderstorms, but now she appeared to have witnessed death itself. Within hours, our store's phone was ringing non-stop as families from all over the area called in a desperate attempt to find answers and describe the same horrifying symptoms. The Crawfords' animals were dropping dead in their yard, and the Petersons had sent their twin children to the emergency department after they began vomiting blood. Old Mr. Fitzgerald passed out on his porch, and his mailman discovered him convulsing and foaming at the mouth. The strangest part was the pattern. The hospital in the next town over was overrun with families driving in from all directions, carrying unconscious relatives and screaming children, and every single call painted the same nightmare picture. People drinking their morning coffee or giving their children a glass of water, then becoming violently ill within hours. My family, the Whites who lived next door, and the Kowalskis who owned the cafe were all doing well, but the families that were impacted were all in rural sections of Mercer, and not everyone was becoming sick, had their own wells, and all lived in a rough horseshoe shape around the town's eastern edge. I recall looking at the map my dad had pinned to the wall behind our counter, which marked each impacted household with a red thumbtack. The pattern was too intentional to be coincidental, too exact to be random. Something was going after these particular families, and as the day went on, more the state health department arrived by Friday, a convoy of white vans and officials in hazmat suits who converted our sleepy town into what felt like a catastrophe zone, and they began testing everything. On that map, red thumbtacks emerged, creating a crimson arc of pain that made my skin crawl. I offered to help coordinate with the local families, and Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the lead investigator, set up a makeshift command center in our high school gymnasium. She was a sharp woman with steel grey hair and eyes that didn't miss anything: soil samples, water from every well, even the air we breathed. We found industrial chemicals in the affected wells, she whispered gently, drawing me aside that evening. Trichlorophyll, benzene, heavy metals, stuff that shouldn't exist anywhere near a residential area. This isn't a natural pollution or accident. These people are being purposefully poisoned by someone in our neighborhood, someone we knew and trusted was deliberately poisoning their neighbors, Dr. Hartwell stated. And the realization struck me like a physical blow. To think that one of our own could be capable of such calculated evil made me reevaluate everything I thought I knew about the people I'd grown up with. The chemicals were costly industrial solvents, the kind used in manufacturing and metalwork, not something you'd find lying around a farm or small town. Whoever was doing this had access to dangerous materials and knew exactly what they were doing. The investigation took an unsettling turn when Dr. Hartwell's team found that the contamination wasn't random, but rather surgical. I couldn't sleep that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I'd unintentionally shaken hands with a monster, if I'd struck up a conversation with someone who was slowly killing children. The culprit had used a specialized drill bit, the type used for precision work, and somehow managed to inject the chemicals directly into the water supply without leaving obvious traces. Each affected well had been purposefully accessed with tiny holes drilled near the wellheads and carefully concealed. The FBI was called in, and all of a sudden our small town was teeming with federal agents who were asking questions about everyone and everything. They set up surveillance equipment, conducted interviews, and began creating profiles of every resident who might know something. This was all planned, methodical, and executed with frightening expertise. And the means to execute such an attack. The timeline was even more horrifying. The chemicals were being introduced in small doses, gradually building up in people's systems until they reached toxic levels, and the contamination had been occurring for weeks, perhaps months, before anyone became ill enough to notice. The monster doing this wasn't just trying to make people sick. They were slowly, methodically destroying lives, families, and futures. Some of the victims, especially the elderly and children, were exhibiting signs of permanent organ damage. For example, 7-year-old Amy Peterson had kidney problems that doctors said might never fully heal. It was nearly impossible to understand the calculated cruelty of it all, and I found myself examining the faces of everyone I encountered, wondering if they could be capable of such inhuman behavior. The breakthrough came on a rainy Monday morning, when Agent Rebecca Stone, a small woman with intense green eyes and a nonsense demeanor, knocked on our store door before we had even opened. We need to talk about land ownership in this area," she continued, laying out a thorough survey map on our counter, with a demeanor that made me think of my high school administrator. "All the affected properties have something in common. All of them are situated on the Whitmore Ranch's border, which is excellent grazing territory." The name was like a kick to the stomach. It seemed completely implausible that Caleb Whitmore, a third-generation rancher who owned more than 2,000 acres of the finest cattle land in eastern Oklahoma and was a well-respected member of the community, a member of the school board, and a generous donor to the church, could be responsible for this. However, a terrible picture emerged as Agent Stone presented the evidence. Whitmore had been quietly trying to buy up all the properties around his ranch for the past 2 years, making lowball offers that most families had turned down. The contaminated wells were all on properties he had attempted to buy, and the contamination pattern precisely matched the boundaries of the land he wanted to acquire. It's one of the most well-planned real estate schemes we've ever seen. He's been systematically poisoning his neighbors to force them off their properties, Agent Stone explained, her voice icy with disgust. Once they're desperate enough, he swoops in with cash offers for their worthless, contaminated land. I became physically ill when I realized that someone could plan such extensive misery in order to grow their corporate empire. This was about a total lack of human conscience, not simply money. The arrest took place that same afternoon, and I'll never forget the scene. Whitmore was having lunch with his family when FBI agents surrounded his ranch house as if it were just another Tuesday. When they released him in handcuffs, he appeared truly bewildered, acting as though he was an innocent man falsely accused. But they had discovered everything. They found that he had been buying the chemicals through a phony company he had set up in Texas, using false documentation and paying in cash, as well as barrels of industrial chemicals concealed in an old barn, drilling equipment containing traces of the contaminated soil, and most damning of all, a detailed map showing exactly which wells he had targeted and when. What haunts me most is how easily he deceived us all. Even after his arrest, when the evidence was overwhelming, Whitmore, who had been sitting next to me at church every Sunday for 20 years, had been living a double life as a calculated poisoner. He had been the guy who helped neighbors fix their tractors, who brought casseroles to families when the FBI discovered documents that he had been planning this scheme for more than 3 years, researching the health effects of various chemicals, coaching Little League, and carefully timing his attacks to maximize suffering while minimizing suspicion. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and each and every affected family received a sizable payment. However, the damage was done. Our community never felt the same, and many people never truly recovered. When trust is violated on such a basic level, it causes scars that never totally go away. Pine Valley, Idaho, has always been the type of town where secrets don't stay buried long, where everyone waves at each other from their pickup trucks, and where the biggest excitement usually comes from arguing about which fertilizer brand works best on corn. Almost 30 years later, I still test my water periodically and still wonder about the people I thought I knew. In 2018, I graduated from nursing school and started working as a registered nurse at Pine Valley Community Clinic, which was located directly on Main Street in an old brick facility that had been operated by Dr. Martinez since the Carter administration. On most days, we treated everything from old Mr. Stevens constantly inquired about my mom's garden. Mrs. Rodriguez would bring us baked cookies every Thursday, and the elderly people in town loved us like family despite our high blood pressure. Before October 2023 altered my understanding of healing people, it seemed like the ideal place to start a career. The trouble began with Diane Walsh, our head medical assistant, who had been there for nearly 20 years and was a gentle woman in her 50s with graying hair that was always pulled back in. A Dr. Martinez trusted Diane completely because she had a neat bun, these wire-rimmed glasses that made her look like everyone's favorite librarian, knew every patient's medication history by heart, could draw blood from the most difficult veins, and had a gentle way of talking to scared kids that instantly stopped them from crying. I would say that Diane was the most caring person I had ever met, which is why I still have nightmares about what happened next. She essentially ran the day-to-day operations, while he concentrated on diagnosis and treatment plans. She was loved by all the elderly patients because she would sit with them during procedures, holding their hands and telling them stories about her grandchildren. When I arrived at the clinic at 7 a.m. on a Thursday in late October to get ready for our early appointments, Diane was already there, sitting in the break room with her coffee mug tightly gripped between both hands. This was the first indication that anything was off when I asked her if she was okay. She only murmured something about having a difficult night and walked off to start her morning ritual, which wasn't like her at all. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen like she'd been sobbing, and she had this thousand-why gaze that made my chest tighten. Normally the first to joke and inquire about everyone's weekend plans, Diane had been quieter and more reserved lately, which I attributed to stress from her husband's recent cancer diagnosis. But there was something off about her energy that I couldn't shake. When we lost 3 senior patients in 2 weeks, the genuine alarm bells began to ring. She walked around the clinic if she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and whenever she thought no one was looking, her face would collapse into this expression of absolute fatigue. Death wasn't particularly unusual in Pine Valley, where there were plenty of people in their 80s and 90s, but these cases were different. Each one had been very stable when they came in for regular checkups, and within 48 hours of coming to our clinic, they all died quietly in their sleep. Mrs. Chen died on Wednesday night after complaining of joint discomfort. Grayson, who had been doing a great job managing his diabetes, died on a Monday night. And then there was old Pete Murphy, who had been making jokes about they all described the same thing. Their family members had appeared unusually calm and sleepy after their appointments, then simply never woke up the next morning. They outlived his third wife just days before he passed away quietly in his recliner. Their families were devastated, but thankful that their loved ones had not suffered. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was seriously wrong, even though Dr. Martinez insisted it was just one of those sad coincidences. What made it worse was seeing Diane's behavior become more and more unpredictable. She had begun volunteering to take care of all the medication preparations for our elderly. She would disappear into the supply closet for unusually long periods of time during appointments, and when she came out, she had this strange, almost peaceful expression on her face. I noticed that she had started staying late after we closed, claiming that she needed to organize patient files. She insisted that she wanted to relieve some of the burden on everyone else. The most disturbing thing, though, was that she had begun to speak differently about our elderly patients, saying things like how tired they looked or they seemed to be suffering more instead of her usual warm grandmotherly concern. Whenever I offered to help, she would quickly decline and practically push me toward the door. Diane simply shook her head and said something about people hiding their pain to protect their families. When I mentioned that Mrs. Jun had seemed pretty cheerful during her last visit, her entire demeanor had changed from nurturing to something that felt almost predatory, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The tipping point was a Friday afternoon when I happened to walk in on Diane making medicine in the supply room. She was bent over a tiny glass vial, drawing up what appeared to be a clear liquid, with a syringe, certainly not any of the usual drugs we usually gave. Her face went white, and she began to stammer about having to double-check the dosages for Mr. Williamson's blood pressure medication after hearing me enter. She jumped like she had been electrocuted and hurriedly shoved the vial into her pocket. I asked her directly what was in the vial, and she gave me this lengthy, meandering explanation about preparing emergency medications just in case, but her voice was trembling and she refused to look at me. The problem is that Mr. Williamson was scheduled for a routine physical, not any sort of injection or for treatment. Then the terrible truth began to sink in and I realized I might be working with a murderer. I spent the entire weekend in a panic trying to figure out what to do as she left the room, and I looked at our medication inventory and discovered we were missing several vials of Mazolam, a potent sedative that in high doses could easily stop someone's breathing. After all, this was Diane, the person who taught me how to properly comfort grieving families and who continued to send birthday cards to former patients. So I wanted to think I was making assumptions with this information, but the evidence was getting harder to ignore. So I began looking through. Our chilling pattern was found by comparing the appointment times of the elderly patients who passed away with recent patient files. All of them had been scheduled for late afternoon appointments when the majority of the staff had already left, leaving only Diane and Dr. Martinez in the building. What was more unsettling was upon calling their families to offer condolences, a number of them mentioned that their loved ones had appeared unusually drowsy and peaceful after their appointments, describing them as ready to go and at peace with everything. The picture that emerged was that all of these patients had received vitamin B12 injections, which were not part of their regular treatment plans, according to their charts. The confrontation occurred on Monday morning when I could no longer bear the weight of my suspicions. Diane had been methodically identifying patients she thought were in pain, then giving them deadly doses of sedatives under the pretense of routine care. I arrived early and discovered Diane already getting ready for the day, carefully setting out supplies with the same uncanny composure she had been exhibiting for weeks. When I told her I knew what she had been doing, she simply sat down heavily in her chair and began to cry, confessing everything through her tears, observing these old patients' suffering and illness, how their families appeared so worn out from providing care, and how she'd persuaded herself that she was doing good deeds, repeatedly saying that she was assisting them in finding peace, and that she could no longer stand to see them suffer. The most terrifying part was when she explained the procedure, how she'd wait until Dr. Martinez, who genuinely thought she was being compassionate, was busy with other patients before giving the Mito injections, while holding their hands and reassuring them that everything would be all right. The total discrepancy between her actions and her intentions made my skin crawl. Here was someone I had fully trusted, someone who had taught me about patient care, and what happened next was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. I told Diane that I had to report what she'd confessed, and she simply nodded as if she'd been expecting it, not pleading with me to remain silent or telling me that she had been playing God with people's lives while convincing herself she was saving them. When I contacted the police, my voice was shaking so much that the dispatcher had to ask me to repeat myself 3 times. She just sat there looking completely dejected, as if all the fight had been drained out of her. Within an hour, little it was weird, with the clinic packed with detectives and Diane being brought away in handcuffs as news teams gathered outside. She had been getting ready to assist patients that morning, and by noon, she was facing several murder charges. The families of the deceased patients were caught between grief and rage, and Martinez was distraught when he learned of it, stating repeatedly that he should have seen something, but in all honesty, Diane had been so careful that even someone who paid close attention have missed the signals. The investigation found that Diane killed at least 7 elderly patients over the course of 3 months, all with overdoses of Mito given during routine appointments. Some felt deceived, believing their loved ones had been murdered, while others acknowledged they were almost relieved their family members had passed away peacefully rather than enduring a protracted illness. Discovered in her card detailed notes, she had written about each patient's suffering and why she was helping them transition. Some of the entries were heartbreaking, describing how she had sat with patients who had terminal cancer and felt overwhelmed by their suffering, how she had witnessed family members grapple with the financial and emotional strain of caring for elderly relatives. In her perverted reasoning, she believed she was delivering a service that the medical system was unable to provide, putting an end to suffering before it became intolerable. What was most unsettling was how meticulous she had been. She had studied the precise dosages required to induce respiratory failure, scheduled her injections 4 times, when Dr. while putting on the front of being the clinic's most caring caregiver, Martinez was preoccupied and even rehearsed her justifications for why patients appeared drowsy after their appointments. During the 6-month trial, I was required to testify about what I had seen and how I had found the missing medications. Diane gave a lengthy speech to her sentencing, explaining that she had been working to spare families the pain of witnessing their loved ones decline, and that the medical system had failed these patients by keeping them alive when they were ready to die. Diane pleaded guilty to 7 counts of secondary murder and was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge wasn't buying it, even though she insisted that her actions had been driven by compassion rather than malice. He referred to her as a predator who had taken advantage of the trust of vulnerable patients and their families, and he said that her acts of kindness didn't justify her cold-blooded murder. It was both satisfying and heartbreaking to watch her get sentenced because I saw glimmers of the woman who had been my mentor and who had taught me to always be patient. It was like seeing 2 very different people inhabit the same body, and I still found it difficult to reconcile the compassionate co-worker I had known with the murderer she had turned into. Dr. Martinez retired right away, claiming he couldn't trust himself to adequately oversee personnel are ignoring such clear warning signs, and the Pine Valley Community Clinic never reopened following the controversy. The building sits. I moved to a hospital in Boise, but I still have nightmares about finding those missing medication vials and wondering how many other patients there are. It's empty. Might have died if I hadn't learned Diane's secret. The toughest part is that I kind of understand why she did it. It's cruel to watch people suffer, and it's normal for anyone working in healthcare to want to help them find peace, but there's a boundary between compassion and murder. The summer of 1993 in Milford changed my perspective on the world, and Diane crossed it 7 times while telling herself she was doing the right thing. I will never forget the look on her face when she confessed, that mixture of guilt and self-righteousness that made me realize how dangerous good intentions can become when they aren't tempered by respect for a human life and choice. I worked as a shift supervisor at the local cheese processing facility at the age of 28, ensuring that our small town's pride and joy continued to produce the wheels of cheddar that made us famous throughout Wisconsin. At 5 in the morning, I was enjoying what most people would consider a simple life. I would get up, work until 3:00 p.m. at my small rental home on Elm Street, and then return home to read whatever paperback I had borrowed from the library or play with my motorcycle. In the garage, the county fair and the escaping of someone's animals were always the biggest events in Milford, where everyone knew each other's business. The most scandalous event in years was when Mrs. Thornton's hens mysteriously wound up in the whole thing. Began on a Wednesday morning in late June, when the air still had that ideal summer coolness and smelled of freshly cut grass and wild flowers from the fields around town. Bible study in the church basement. That's the kind of routine, peaceful life I thought I'd signed up for when I left Milwaukee behind. Nothing out of the ordinary. Our mailman always did his rounds at 7:30, and I was getting ready for work, had just finished my coffee, and was reaching for my keys when I heard the typical rumbling of the mail truck coming down the street. In addition to the usual bills and grocery store circulars, however, I noticed something unusual in my box when I went outside to get the mail before going to the plant. A simple manila envelope with my name written in block letters across the front and no return address. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical, as if someone had taken great care to ensure that each letter was properly shaped. A cassette tape, the type you could purchase at any pharmacy, with a white label that said only "Listen," was contained. In the envelope, I thought it was a joke or perhaps a local band attempting to get their songs recognized, so I nearly threw it away. When I got home from work that evening, however, I decided to plug it into my old boombox out of curiosity. The first few seconds were just static, that familiar hiss you get from inexpensive recording equipment, and then I heard voices, to I initially believed that someone had inadvertently recorded over a blank cassette or had overheard a radio program or television show, but as I continued to listen, the voices got more distinct and clear. One of them was a woman's voice. One was an old man, his voice shaky and exhausted, discussing how his arthritis was acting up and how he'd been having trouble sleeping. The conversation was so routine, so personal that it felt wrong to be listening, but then the woman said something that sent a chill down my spine. The other was gentle and worried, inquiring about doctor's appointments and medication schedules. The tape went on for another 10 minutes, clearly recording a private conversation between a daughter and her elderly father. "Dad, I wish you'd let me move that old radio from your bedroom. It's been acting up lately, making weird noises at night." Hearing it replayed on this anonymous tape felt extremely intrusive, as if I were listening in on something sacred. They discussed things like grocery shopping, his physical therapy sessions, and whether he needed assistance with his medication. Ordinary, everyday conversations that take place behind closed doors in families. When the tape finally ended, I sat there looking at the boombox, trying to understand what I had just heard. The quality was also surprisingly good, clear, as if the microphone had been in the room with them, rather than as if someone had held a tape recorder up to a window. Conversation. More importantly, why would they send it to me? I didn't recognize the voices, but the woman's tone made me think of someone I might have met in town. The entire experience left me feeling uneasy, as if I had stumbled into something I shouldn't have known about. I was unable to focus the following morning at work, and as I was inspecting the production line, my thoughts kept returning to that tape. During my lunch break, I happened to be chatting with Carl, one of the older men who had spent his entire life in Milford, without bringing up the tape. Carl scratched his greying beard and said that his neighbour, Mrs. Henley, had been acting suspiciously lately, saying that someone was watching her house, and that the Webbers down on Main Street had been fighting more than usual, loud enough for passers-by to hear. He was asked if he had heard anything unusual going on in town lately. The more I considered it, the more certain I became that I wasn't the only one who had received an unwanted delivery. At the time, I assumed it was just ordinary small-town gossip, but now I wonder if those arguments were taking place because they had received their own mysterious tapes. I decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood that evening in the hopes of clearing my head and possibly spotting something out of the ordinary, because there was something methodical about the whole thing, to plan to be a random prank. Milford had always been the type of neighborhood where people left their windows open on summer nights, where you could, as I passed the familiar houses on Elm Street, I began to notice features I had never seen before, such the Sandersons' new ceramic garden gnomes sitting by their front porch, and the faint sounds of television shows and dinner conversations drifting from house to house. Mrs. Carmichael's house had a new wooden birdhouse mounted on her fence post painted bright blue, with yellow trim, and the Mitchells had just hung a decorative wind chime near their kitchen window, and I could see through the glass that they were eating dinner at their little table. It was one of those kitschy items you'd find at a flea market or garage sale. The community centre's monthly flea market had been especially busy this summer, with vendors bringing in all kinds of garden decorations and household items. These decorations were harmless enough, the kind of things people pick up to brighten their yards, but seeing them all together, clustered in the same few blocks, made me realize that many people had been shopping at the same places recently. The tape that arrived on Friday morning was different. Rather than a single conversation, it was made up of fragments of several recordings, as if someone had pieced together bits and pieces from other homes. As I was cleaning the dishes, I overheard a man griping about his boss. Although the audio quality was consistently excellent across all the recordings, with that same crisp clarity that suggested professional equipment, I was particularly disturbed when I recognized one of the voices. It was Janet from the Post office talking to her sister about her husband's drinking problem, and even what sounded like a couple having an intimate conversation in their bedroom. I'd been in line behind Janet at the grocery store only a week before, and her unique laugh was identifiable. So when she told me about her daughter's college tuition payments, it hit me like a blow. These weren't just strangers. That afternoon, I couldn't stand it any longer. These were my neighbors, people I saw every day in town, and someone was methodically filming private conversations in homes all across Milford and sharing the evidence, like some strange kind of entertainment. Clutching both tapes in a paper bag, I headed straight to the sheriff's office, where Sheriff Morrison, a good man I'd had a few beers with at the annual firefighters fundraiser, looked at me like I was crazy, listened to about 30 seconds of the first tape, and then shrugged it back. I attempted to convince him that these were real conversations, and that I would recognize Janet's voice, but he refused to listen. "Could be anybody, Tom," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Perhaps someone has a police scanner picking up phone conversations, or maybe it's just actors, people making up stories for some kind of radio show project." He said he would investigate if I brought him something more specific, but I could tell he felt I was wasting his time. The sheriff's attitude was frustrating, but not totally surprising, as Milford was the type of place where serious crimes simply did not happen, and the biggest law enforcement challenge was typically breaking up fights at the tavern on Saturday nights. I knew I was alone with this mystery as I left that office, so I launched my own investigation over the weekend, starting with a visit to the community centre, where the monthly flea market was held in the hopes of gaining some information about recent vendors or odd goods that had been sold. When I explained that I wanted information about household goods and decorative items, the Scents volunteer coordinator, an elderly woman named Doris, was surprisingly helpful, pulling out a thick binder that contained vendor registration forms and receipts from the previous few months. As we turned the pages, one name kept coming up. The vendor, Hartley Electronics and Collectibles, had been particularly active over the past 2 months, consistently setting up in the same location and selling refurbished radios, novelty clocks, decorative items with built-in speakers, and even some garden ornaments with small weather monitoring devices, according to the records. The more I learned about this Hartley character, the more I liked him. Doris remembered him as a quiet, middle-aged man with thick glasses who always paid his table fees in cash. He told her he was clearing out his late father's electronics repair shop, selling off old inventory and personal collections. As I grew more certain that he was the source of the tapes, I began compiling a list of all the houses where I had observed recent purchases from the flea market and comparing them to the conversations I had overheard on the recordings. The pattern was becoming evident. Those tapes appeared to be from every home that had purchased goods from the flea market. The fact that this was targeted surveillance, someone had purposefully placed listening devices in everyday objects, knowing that individuals would bring them into their most intimate areas, was what really made my skin crawl. The wind chimes, the birdhouses, the decorative radios, and the porcelain gnomes were all possible hiding places for tiny microphones. On Sunday afternoon, I took another stroll about my neighborhood, this time carrying a notepad that I used to record any new household objects or decorations I saw. I decided to take matters into my own hands on Monday morning because the evidence was so overwhelming. At least a dozen homes had bought items from the flea market in the past several months, and I was ready to wager that each and every one of those families had received their own anonymous tapes. I drove to the addresses on Hartley's vendor registration forms after calling in sick to work. The first was a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town with mail spilling out of the mailbox and newspapers stacked on the front porch, obviously abandoned. The second took me to a vacant lot where a house had clearly been demolished months before. But the third address was different. It was a real electronics repair shop, just 30 meters from Milford on the opposite side of the county. And the owner, an elderly man named Bob, recognized my name the moment I came in. He clarified that approximately 4 months ago, a man going by the name of Hartley hired storage space in his rear room for 3 months, paying cash up advance. The man claimed to be handling an estate sale and need temporary storage for electronics and collectibles. The storage rental had expired 2 weeks ago, and when the man failed to come to renew or retrieve his belongings, Bob had opened the unit to find it completely empty, save for a few electronics catalogues and some wire clippings. I went back to Milford and did something I had never done before. I went door to door talking to him. He was described as nervous and secretive, and he always came by after hours to access his stored items. To neighbours on the enigmatic tapes, and to my astonishment, practically everyone I talked to had at least one. The Sandersons had received 3 separate tapes, each of which had recordings of their phone calls and dinner talks. We'd all been living in our homes, thinking we were safe and private, while someone had been methodically violating the law. Carmichael had received a tape with her private prayers recorded from her bedroom, and the Mitchells had received recordings of their arguments over money and their conversations about their son's problems at school. The neighborhood was filled with anger, but it was tempered by a profound sense of powerlessness. The man named Hartley had disappeared. The sheriff wasn't paying any attention to us, and we were left with the unnerving realization that our private lives had been broadcast to strangers. About 15 of us gathered at the community center that evening to discuss our options, and we made the decision to thoroughly inspect every item we had bought at the flea market. What we discovered validated our worst suspicions: tiny microphones concealed in. We spent the following week removing and destroying every suspicious object we could find, including speakers wired to transmit rather than receive, electronic devices, and even some garden decorations with advanced recording equipment disguised as weather sensors. But the harm was already done. I was working maintenance for the County Roads Division at the time. Just long days, patching asphalt and clearing brush along the back highways near Lisbon, the kind of job where you knew everyone by name, or at least by truck, but the sense of security we'd all taken for granted was gone forever. By mid-afternoon that day, I was wrapping up near County Road 18, which is near one of those rest stops that nobody ever really uses. You know, the kind with 2 broken picnic tables, a faded vending machine that had probably not worked since the 90s, and a single bathroom that somehow always smelled like bleach and mildew at the same time. I had turned in at around 6 o'clock that morning. I had passed it 100 times without giving it any thought, but that day something felt off, not spooky or dramatic, just out of the ordinary. At 4 o'clock, I saw a cruiser parked crookedly at the sheriff's department was at the far end of the lot, partially in the grass. I initially assumed the deputy inside had stopped to make a call or take a sleep, but as I drove past, I noticed the driver's side door was open. I got out, walked up, shouted out a couple of times, "Hello," and peered inside. But there was no one else around. The lights weren't blinking, the engine was idling, and the radio was still squawking with dispatch talk like someone had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. I knew the name on the screen: Deputy Lane Kessler, a young, kind man who had only been on the force for a year or 2, but was well liked by everyone. The laptop computer was still logged in, and there was a half-empty bottle of water in the cup holder. He was the type of person who always waved when he passed and purchased a coffee for an elderly veteran who didn't have enough change at the cafe off Route 1. That was the last time I saw him. He didn't fit in his car, so it didn't make sense for him to leave it that way. I didn't touch anything, but backed up, dialed the non-emergency number, and described what I observed. The rest stop backs up to an old cornfield on one side and a cluster of trees on the other, rich with those thick grasping branches that always seemed to block the sun even at noon. I continued to check the tree line while I waited. I didn't see any movement, but the silence felt oppressive. In 20 minutes, 2 patrol units arrived, followed by an unmarked SUV, and things quickly spiraled out of control. It wasn't the calm kind, more like the world was holding its breath. They quickly cordoned off the area. When I arrived, it was completely empty. not even tire tracks that appeared new other than mine and the cruiser's. I stood back near my truck, while one of the deputies asked me to describe what I saw, including how long the car had been there and whether I noticed any other cars, people, or anything odd. I mentioned that the passenger door had a smudge near the handle, almost greasy, as if someone with filthy gloves had touched it, and it was difficult to miss in the sunlight. They continued to circle the area, but it was just grass, cracked pavement, and trees that didn't respond. The town's Facebook page went viral that night, with several claiming to have seen a white van parked close to the rest stop that night and others saying he was ambushed. One thing stood out, though. No one saw him after midnight. You know how people become when there are no answers, so they fill in the holes themselves. Just before 12:40 a.m., according to his most recent radio record, he called in for a routine check. After that, there was nothing, no follow-up, no distress call until I located the car nearly 4 hours later. Whatever occurred, it was swift, tidy, and silent. The hunt intensified over the following few days, with helicopters flying over the fields and dogs being brought in. The woods were searched by volunteers, and I participated in the Saturday morning grid search, walking between rows of corn that reached my shoulders 4 hours. During that time, it seemed as though we were searching for someone who had vanished, not just gone, but gone as if he had been taken from the world and erased. There were no bloodstains, broken branches, or footprints, but some of the guys mentioned a space farther into the woods that wasn't shown on any of the maps, saying it appeared as though people had been congregating there by Monday. The sheriffs. We stopped receiving information once the department changed its tone and brought in federal officers. But word gets out. According to Brent, one of my friends from the county road crew, he had been seeing trucks pull off that exit late at night for months. No marks, box trucks, never stayed long, always in and gone before morning, and we all assumed they were either supply runs or construction personnel. A week after the disappearance, a farmer named Len Harben discovered a jacket buried behind a mound of brush close to the south boundary of his land. It now appeared more planned and coordinated, and perhaps Nick saw, Deputy Kessler had caught, a sight of something he wasn't supposed to. The name tag was still on it, and it was a typical sheriff's problem, not visible from the road, approximately 2 miles from the rest stop. They never mentioned it in public, but rumors circulated that there was blood on the collar, and that's when everything started. Unmarked trucks arrived that same afternoon, and by the evening, the brush had been cleared, the soil tested, and a large portion of his land had been marked off. Len later told me that they had discovered tire impressions leading into a dirt trail that he was unaware existed, as if it had been used and covered again. This further locked down the area. Officially, Deputy Kessler's body was never located, but a month or two everything had calmed down. I received a brief message on Facebook from a stranger, no mutual friends, no profile picture, and he did the right thing. Don't discuss that day with anyone else. I'll admit that I didn't get much sleep that night, so I erased the message, logged off, and haven't mentioned it since. Perhaps I ought to have given it to someone, but I kind of assumed they already was aware, whoever they are. The department eventually threw a memorial service for him, complete honors, his mother said. The entire community arrived, silently lining Main Street. As the lights gently spun as the cruisers passed, I was standing close to the rear and observed, but the image of the cruiser sitting there with the door open kept coming to mind, as if he'd went outside for a little moment, as if he believed that anything he saw would not cause any issues. Whatever the procedure was, whatever was going on, whether it was weaponry, trafficking, or something else entirely, it was significant enough to make a person go undetected and silent enough that the majority of people still don't think it actually happened that way. I occasionally still pass the rest area on my way out to fix potholes or salt the roads, generally in the early morning. Winter, it appears to be vacant. Now that the vending machine has been removed, merely where it was, a concrete slab. However, I always catch myself when I slow down. Half expecting someone to emerge, I check the undergrowth beyond the guardrail and the tree edge. I never put an end to it. No more. It made careful to clean whatever was outside that evening. It left just enough for the rest of us to remember, but it left up after itself, and to keep silent.